Order, order. Welcome to this morning's evidence session of the Transport Committee. This is a one-off session in the light of the Chancellor's recent announcement on Heathrow expansion in the context of economic growth. We may come back to look at aviation in due course with a full inquiry. But today we're examining how clear the links are between airport expansion and economic growth across the whole country. So could I ask each of the witnesses on our first panel to introduce themselves?
I'm Dr. Alex Chapman from the New Economics Foundation, Senior Economist.
I'm Chris Cuttle, an Associate Director at Frontier Economics.
And I'm Brian Pearce, Professor Brian Pearce at University College London, Air Transport Systems Laboratory.
Hi, I'm Marc Postle. I'm here as an independent economic consultant with previous airport expansion analysis experience.
And welcome today. And could I also ask, because we're going to try and cover a lot of ground today, could you make your responses brief and refer to publicly published material as a way to save time if that's possible? And I know each of you have published a fair bit of information over the years, so thank you. Could I start by asking Professor Brian Pearce, is the global aviation picture the same now as it was when the Airports Commission, which you were involved with, conducted its analysis of the different options for airport expansion in 2015? And if it's not the same, why not?
No, it's not. When the Airports Commission were looking at the third runway recommendation a decade ago, the world was a much more tranquil place, and what came to be their sort of central scenario was essentially an extrapolation of those benign trends. Since then, we've had some major changes in the world. It's become much more fragmented, geopolitically, trade, a lot more protectionism. We've had some major shocks, of course. The two most notable being the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the war in Ukraine. We've just about seen the global aviation industry recovering back to pre-COVID 2019 levels on many metrics. So now, the number of flights and connections, passengers are back to those levels. We've lost about 4 or 5 years growth. But overall, I think all of those impacts, the war in Ukraine has led to higher inflation, higher costs. We've seen a downward revision in long-term growth projections. Basically, we're now looking at air transport growth on a slower trajectory than the one that we saw back a decade ago.
Thank you. And has the UK's position in global aviation changed?
I don't think so, no. And actually, the UK has always it's been a leader in many respects in terms of development of transport regulation, aerospace with Rolls-Royce and with leading airports and airlines. The London air travel market is the largest in the world, second, ahead of New York and Tokyo. Particularly so for passengers paying premium fares, which are the majority are likely to be business passengers. So London has twice as many premium fare paying passengers as New York or Tokyo. It's a very important part of the market, and I think an important part of the growth element in this. Heathrow has been losing ground over the years, particularly to the Gulf Airlines and Dubai, but it's still the second busiest international airport, and on many metrics it's actually still the top airport for international connections, which again I think is an important part of the growth story for both business travel and for trade. Those haven't changed. But obviously Heathrow's been full for 2 decades.
Thank you. Okay, Baggy.
Okay, good morning. So the next few questions just on how aviation contributes to the UK economy. So really simply, how do airports generate economic growth? And if you could just each of you cover, directly and indirectly, what sectors are impacted?
I guess I'll start with the non-controversial stuff. I think it's important to recognise airports have a vital role in modern transportation, and through that, in terms of the economy, just providing linkage, both for travel, business meetings like freight, and also providing access to holiday destinations, making places a nice place to live. And I think that's just recognisable. They're large businesses in and of themselves, locations for other businesses, such as retail, hospitality. You can look at employment and say, oh, look, there's an airport, there are jobs. Now, we all recognise that that's the case. There's benefits, but there's also costs. And I think it's just worth pointing out before going into sectors and such, that within the UK, we're not really discussing whether or not we're bringing connectivity for the first time. We're talking about already connected places. And the question's not about do airports cause, or are airports sources of growth? The question is the additional flights worth the additional costs? So.
I think what I would add to that is if we're thinking about how air transport and airports in particular help economic growth, I think we need to distinguish between bringing spending to the economy, which sort of tourism might do, which I think is not really where I would place the emphasis. I think growth is really created by building assets and capabilities to enable non-inflationary growth. So what we're talking about with an expansion of capacity in London is to enable high-tech businesses essentially to trade and also for business travellers to gain business and also to get ideas and technology transfer that improve the productivity of those businesses using the airport. So I don't think it's anything to do with the sort of tourism spend or the employment at the airport. It's the asset that we're creating there to help British business.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. So I think aviation generates value in lots of different ways, and it's because there's lots of different passengers flying around. So we'll have business, leisure, visiting friends and relatives. We'll have UK-based passengers flying abroad, foreign passengers coming to the UK. We have cargo as well. So there's lots of different types of activity happening. And the science in terms of how we value that activity has definitely been evolving over time. So I think as Brian mentioned, maybe if you look at some old airport economic impact studies, they often tend to just focus on how many workers are employed at the airport. So there are 50,000 workers at our airport, and that is our contribution to the economy. And to be honest, I never particularly liked sort of many of those studies, because to me it actually kind of ignores why are people actually travelling in the first place and what's the activity that's being enabled. So lots of the science now is focusing a lot more on productivity and well-being as well. So on the business travel side, we know that air travel is an essential input for many businesses. Face-to-face meetings continue to be important. I understand this meeting was meant to be face-to-face rather than virtual, so there's probably a nugget in there somewhere. And even with COVID, there were still more than nearly 30 million business passengers at UK airports last year. So UK businesses collectively spending tens of billions of pounds on business travel. So they must be doing that for a reason. And ultimately, they believe it's because business travel and face-to-face contact help to boost trade and investment. And there's lots of literature now which talks about trade openness and productivity. And it basically says that countries that trade more, whether it's imports or exports, are ultimately more productive. And so there's lots of literature which talks about that point. And secondly, on the leisure point as well, if we think about well-being, sometimes leisure and visiting friends and relatives, I often feel that sometimes that's slightly trivialised as people just going on holiday, spending money abroad. And how can spending money abroad be a good thing for the UK economy? Perhaps we should just lock everyone within the UK. But there's really important well-being, mental health, life satisfaction benefits as well. And I think how many times have we heard people say, I desperately need a holiday, and they come back refreshed and recharged and productivity boosted. So it might sound a little bit woolly, but I think there is a productivity angle in there as well. But noted that I think these points are very hard to quantify.
Thanks.
So I mean, I think if what I'm hearing from here, I generally support, which is the principle that airports are transportation infrastructure, and obviously all jobs are important. Jobs in and around the airport are vital, but fundamentally, you don't build a motorway to create jobs in motorway service stations. It's about where you move people around in the economy and why you move them around. And we've talked a lot about, obviously, you can split the market into leisure and business, and we've heard a lot about business just there. But, of course, there's a fundamental problem here, and that's in the last 20 years, there's been around 25% real terms GDP growth, and there hasn't been a single additional business passenger leaving through our air network in that period. There's been no growth in that market since 2006. So, now, obviously, there's been recovery. I'm not saying that there's not been a sort of year where the numbers have gone up. There was a crash after the financial crisis. There was then some recovery. Then there was another crash through the pandemic. And now we probably will get some recovery. But the latest numbers I've seen suggest that as of 2024, business passengers will be probably still down around about 20% on their pre-COVID level, suggesting that what we've seen is a structural shift in the passenger base. With 20 years without growth, what can we say about the next 20 years? Well, I think we need to be very cautious about what we assume about how much demand there is. I mean, if you look at sort of a measure of how the economy has been developing, one way of doing that is to look at how many business flights there have been for every £1 million of GDP in the economy. So in 1990, we had 6 flights or so per £1 million. By 2000, that had risen to around 8 flights per £1 million. So the aviation intensity of the economy was rising. But by 2019, that had fallen back down to only 6 flights per million, and by 2023 down to 4. Now, obviously, that last data point probably is affected a bit by the legacy of the pandemic, but there's a clear trajectory here that a sort of upward curve is now peaked and is on its way down again. Now, why we have to be careful about that is if we're calibrating our models on that upward phase, which is sort of 1990 through to anywhere around probably about 2010, although there were various disruptions to aviation through that period, that you're assuming that past period is a good forecast of the future, where I would say it's not. And we also talked a bit about leisure passengers. Yes, clearly there is a value to those passengers in general, to those individuals. But it is important to think about what we're doing to the economy when we encourage this huge outflow of cash. So in 2023, about 40 billion net flowed out of the economy. Now, over the years, economists have debated whether that's a problem, that form of spending. There's different schools of thought. Fair to say the original position used to be, well, it doesn't matter, that money goes out of the economy from these leisure passengers. It comes back in some form, typically by foreign investment. That may be so, but there are 2 key factors that I think the last 10 years of economics require us to look more carefully at. The first one is the equity of where it flows out from and where it comes back to. Because if it flows out from the wider regions and comes back into London and the South East, that is not helpful to our strategic aims for the economy, as I understand the way the government wants to see its growth developing. And the second issue is, when that money comes back in, what form does it take? Is it useful investment into the UK economy? The money that we spend overseas in Spain, is it then being invested by Toyota coming and building a new factory in the UK? Or is it what we've seen far more in recent years, for example, purchases of British assets, buy-up of property on the high street, particularly in London and elsewhere, or just buy-up of companies that deliver our public services, and in forms that allow rent extraction by those foreign residents. And that lens through which we see the way that aviation interacts with the economy is one that is, I think, deeply under-discussed. And there are plenty of academic papers that highlight that fact, that actually we probably should be talking more about how this works.
Okay, and I think moving on to the geographic impact of growth, Scott.
Thank you. This is really, really interesting. So I'm an MP for Edinburgh, and some people in Edinburgh would say this is just yet more investment in the southeast of England. A long-term problem the UK has had, I think. So how are people in Edinburgh and elsewhere outside the southeast England going to benefit from investment in airports?
Well, I guess the main argument would be that if you're looking to fly to distant cities for trade, and I think the important thing for growth would be to create business opportunities or technology transfer to boost the productivity we've been talking about. On many routes from the UK, there just aren't enough passengers to make it viable. So you need to consolidate those passengers in a hub, i.e. In London. So the benefit might be that businesses, in particular in Edinburgh, would be able to use those flights in order to generate business and trade.
How does that differ from changing my flight to Amsterdam? How does that differ? How does that benefit Edinburgh more?
It doesn't.
Exactly, yeah.
It doesn't. And lots of people in the north of England, of course, do transfer via Amsterdam or Dubai. So that benefit to Edinburgh can be served by hubs elsewhere. You know, I would say that the majority of those benefits will come in the region of London, particularly with some of the the high-tech clusters that we've got in the region around London rather than Edinburgh.
Mark?
Anyone else on that?
Do you think it's worthwhile, kind of, when you talk about what are the benefits for somewhere like Edinburgh, in the past there's been discussions around like how do you boost domestic connectivity? Because the fact is, and shown out in the modelling for the Airports Commission previously and for the National Policy Statement, that domestic flights within the UK from Heathrow, from those major airports as they grow, are going to be priced out. And the only way to maintain that connectivity is going to be through public subsidy or through basically government action to enforce domestic routes. And so I think that's just something to bear in mind.
I think I'd maybe add as well that capacity constraints at Heathrow come at a cost to the UK in general. So when there are capacity constraints at our only hub airport and the main gateway for long-haul markets, that will come at a cost. So at Heathrow, we have seen passenger volumes increase in recent years, but that's airlines really trying to squeeze out the most they can get. The number of flights are capped. Heathrow's been operating at full capacity for around 20 years. Airlines can deploy larger aircraft, have bigger load factors. They can switch out some short-haul connections for larger capacity, long-haul connections, which I think dampens some of the domestic connectivity that we're talking about. So ultimately, the UK ends up less well connected. There'll be sort of lower frequency on the existing routes that we have, and there'll be fewer connections added because they're squeezed out for sort of the high demand routes. I think we know also that when demand exceeds supply, ticket prices rise. We call that the congestion premium, seen in loads of markets, so whether that's London house prices or tickets for Oasis and Taylor Swift, prices rise. And that means that the passengers who fly end up paying more to do so. But then there's a whole load of passengers who cannot fly, and that activity is being squeezed out. And all of the business passengers or even the leisure, the visiting friends and relatives that would have happened, all of that activity doesn't happen. And as I mentioned before, I think the productivity and the well-being effects, they ripple throughout the economy. They're not just located in the southeast. I mean, I think if a Japanese manufacturing firm was thinking about investing in a new factory in the northeast of England, I think...
Edinburgh.
Then, so I think air connectivity will play an important role in kind of their decision there as well. And I think I'd just point out, I think that the DfT forecast that by 2050, with capacity constraints, I think there might be as many as 100 million passengers per annum that would have flown if we had the capacity, that won't fly if we don't have the capacity. So that's kind of 100 million passengers per annum. So a lot of people, I'm sure there'll be lots of different anecdotes in there around business travel, leisure, and it will be impacting the entire country.
I think the fundamental challenge here again is considering strategically what is it that we're facilitating here, because despite the stated capacity constraints at Heathrow, the business passenger share at Heathrow has been in decline. So there's something not quite right about the logic of this, because all the models suggest that when business passengers are there and they exist, they're willing to pay quite a significant amount more than a leisure passenger is to travel. So if there is capacity already in the system, which there is plenty, there is 300 million passenger movements coming in and out of the UK every year. We are widely regarded as one of the best connected economies in the world. If that connectivity is there and there is business demand, that business demand should be fulfilled within the current system. It will displace the low-value leisure flights, whether that be at a regional airport or through Heathrow, and that is borne out by the DfT's modelling. But that's not what's happening. If anything, it's moving in the opposite direction. So if we look at the latest data from 2024, what we see getting added to the network is more leisure destinations, more resort destinations. 680,000 more passengers now going to Antalya and 220,000 to Dalaman in Turkey, massive growth in Greece, massive growth in the Canary Islands. Now, these destinations are not business destinations. There's massive increases in spending in these places, of course, which is another question as to whether it's good for regional economies, for national economies like Scotland's, to encourage our residents to spend more money, to use a silly analogy, but on dental work in Turkey and other places. That's not helping the UK economy. That is just the reality of it. And what we're seeing, though, if you sort of scrutinise those destinations I've just described that are seeing so much growth, is that they are getting kind of longer haul. Right? We used to just go to southern Spain. Now we're going further for these sort of resort destinations to the Canaries. 4 or 5 hour flights we're talking about now. And I guess the question is, if you therefore are going to expand Heathrow and enable further long-haul destinations, which is principally what Heathrow does, are we just now encouraging those people to go to Bangkok, making it cheaper to go even further? Now, yes, there's probably a welfare benefit to those individuals involved. I'm not going to deny that's the case. But strategically, that's a huge cost to the climate and to wider society. And is that really worth it? Especially when we then consider that those leisure passengers are often frequent flyers who are taking advantage of this. I mean, it's only viable to go to Turkey to get your teeth done because the flights are so cheap. It's, you can get off-peak flights for 30 quid. So how is it beneficial for our UK regions to encourage that type of spending is the question we need to be asking. And if there is this untapped business demand, there are business people in Edinburgh needing connectivity, why are they not being fulfilled already within this massive connectivity, this network we already have? And are there policy interventions government could pursue to chase that green growth, which would be to say, fulfill the business need, but without increasing the overall passenger load and damaging the climate in the process?
Okay, thank you.
Interesting, but I have to change topics very, very slightly. And I think we've touched on this a little bit. So reading the notes that we've been provided for today, I think one of the things that cuts through is that it seems to be quite difficult to actually measure the economic impact of the aviation sector, and even more difficult to predict 60 years into the future, I think, what we're talking about here. So why is it so difficult, and how much uncertainty is there around those future predictions 60 years into the future?
In terms of the impact on the UK economy?
Yes, sorry, yes, thank you.
The income.
Yeah, sorry, I can have a go at that. Frankly, it's quite hard to measure some of these difficult to estimate impacts, right? So in terms of productivity and well-being. The Green Book and WebTag provide guidance on how to carry out cost-benefit analysis, but it's exactly that. It's guidance. It's high-level guidance. It doesn't provide a detailed step-by-step guide for how to carry out cost-benefit analysis for every single conceivable type of investment. And at Heathrow, expansion at Heathrow, there's lots of nuances there. There's international cross-border impacts. There's all this sort of productivity and sort of well-being impacts as well. Green Book does say that you should be trying to measure these productivity benefits where possible, but it notes that they're very hard. Similarly, on the well-being side, try to include them where possible, but it's very, very hard. So the science is evolving in that space. You said in terms of different results producing or different studies producing different results. I would point out though, if you look at the analysis that was carried out by the Airports Commission, and they carried out lots of different types of analysis, not just one. And if you look at the results from the DfT last time around in 2017, 2018, and some of our recent results as well, they all point to sort of very strong net positive cases. So the science will change, and some of the inputs will change as well. So, for instance, Heathrow's passenger forecast and its plan on the ground may subtly change. I think earlier this week they said they were looking to maybe accelerate some of the expansion. So that will obviously have a different impact in terms of costs and benefits. So I think with these things, it's a moving target in terms of the plan on the ground. It's very, very hard to actually estimate some of these.
So how much uncertainty then, when you look 60 years into the future, how much uncertainty is associated with some of the numbers that have been bandied around?
Well, there'll be lots of uncertainty, which is why I think it's really important to carry out lots of different types of analysis as well. So I think the Airports Commission, they produced thousands of pages of analysis, carrying out different approaches, lots of qualitative arguments as well, talking about the importance of hub capacity and so on. So yeah, frankly there is uncertainty because these things are hard to estimate. But when we see so many people flying, I think it's a great thing to be able to get your teeth done quite cheaply abroad in Turkey. Maybe people quite like that, frankly. And so many businesses flying each year. The benefits must be there.
I'm sure this government has a commitment to ensure everybody gets access to an NHS dentist. Did you want to comment on that, Mark?
So I can talk a bit more about why economists disagree generally with those kinds of reports, but just on the topic of forecasts and those scenarios, one of the things I think is very interesting and kind of that maybe is worthwhile taking into consideration of the DfT updated appraisal of the Airports Commission work. So as said, they did a bunch of different scenarios. Now, one of the things to note is that one of those scenarios was around, for example, high carbon costs. What if we're in a world where carbon costs are much higher than what was assumed in 2017? We are in that world. The DfT guidance now is high carbon costs as a central case. There's now a higher cost. If you look at that scenario, none of the things considered at that time are net positive according to the DfT's assessment.
Yeah. Uncertainty.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you need to take forecasts, particularly 60 years out, with a great big pinch of salt, because we just don't know. No one knows.
Alex?
I think also really important to note that given, as we've said, the centrality of business passengers to all of these big numbers, when you put out these big productivity benefits, it's always the business passengers that are driving them. And the Airports Commission, it looks very likely, are fundamentally wrong in the forecasts that they put out in 2014 and 15, because they anticipated growth in the business passenger market quite significantly by 2030. Now, we're not at 2030 yet, so there's still possibility of a huge turnaround. But as opposed to growth, their baseline was 2011. We're looking at the moment at being below that level, which means all of the figures that contributed to the models that they put out, models that actually were, many people had deep concerns about their veracity, as we'll hopefully get to at some point. But nonetheless, those models were based on these forecasts that have been proven to be wrong. And that comes from typically an over-optimism, a bias towards an optimistic view of what the future is rather than a realistic one, which we now need to have, I think, at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Katie?
Just thinking a bit and picking up on what actually a couple of people have said about capacity and demand. So airports in the southeast have operated out or close to capacity for decades. I'm interested what each of you think passenger numbers would be now if capacity had been completely unconstrained over that period of time.
I can have a go at that one. So at Heathrow, we've estimated this congestion premium that I've described before. So this says when supply is fixed and demand rises, prices must rise to price that demand out of the market. We've estimated that impacts on a number of different occasions using different approaches, and we estimate that ticket prices at Heathrow are around 20 to 25% higher than they otherwise would be without those capacity constraints. Across all the passengers, that equates to about £3 billion per annum. The CAA and the DfT also sort of recognise this impact. I think the DfT will call it scarcity rents. The CAA also describes it as well. So if you think about how much demand would be higher, if you think about some price elasticities of demand, I think it possibly suggests maybe in the order around about an extra 20 million passengers at Heathrow per annum. That's sort of a rough estimate there.
That's just at Heathrow?
Yes, but I mean the capacity constraints are at Heathrow, so I guess if there aren't constraints at other airports, then there's not really sort of demand being priced out.
So the capacity constraints determine the higher ticket prices and not the higher landing charges, and presumably in the long term the recouping the cost of the additional infrastructure.
Yes, that's correct. So you'll find you put flights on the market, prices rise if there's lots of demand for them. So that's the dynamic there.
I agree with what's said. I think I would also suggest if you're thinking about whether or not there is underlying demand for more capacity, particularly at Heathrow, look at the market for slots. Yeah. Because what we see is those are incredibly valuable. Airlines are willing to pay tens of millions of pounds for a slot pair. And presumably they're doing this because they can see that there is the demand there from high-value passengers, which I think are more going to be business passengers than people wanting to fly to Spain.
Okay.
I was just coming on that.
Alex.
So I think I have a slightly different philosophical view of the way that sort of this question should be addressed. So the residents of the UK, a householder in the UK, is presented with, has, say, £1,000 in the bank, and they're presented a range of different things they could spend that money on, which give them different levels of value in return. And the idea that they sort of, there's a position promoted, I think, heavily by the industry that it's just an inevitability that these households want to go overseas. That is what they demand. The demand is there. But that's, in reality, that's not how it works, right? So a household is making a decision between one good and another, and they make, obviously, a lot to do on the price. Now, we have been through a period of the last 20, 30 years where the pricing structures around aviation have massively incentivized households to spend their money there. That is, no VAT, no fuel duty, more or less unfettered expansion of airports. Obviously, there's been lots of different cases there, but broadly speaking, the previous governments have had very positive and airport-friendly policies, and has allowed the industry to continue not paying, for example, the fair costs of the environmental damage it does. It doesn't pay its costs. That's just a fairly well-known fact. So by cutting artificially the price of air travel against other competitor products, such as the UK's domestic tourism industry, which hasn't benefited from the same treatment over the years, you're pushing households to make that choice. It's not an inevitability. In fact, when you ask households, many of them, why did you fly abroad this year? They say it's because it's cheaper. Would they have gone domestically? Yes, they would have done. But they're making that trade-off because they're incentivized to make that trade-off. So it's not kind of like what is the correct counterfactual? I would say the correct counterfactual is one where aviation pays its way, and we look at, once the ticket price is actually a fair ticket price, then how much demand is there for that product.
And what do you think the answer is to that?
I suspect that the demand would be considerably lower if it was paying its full carbon costs of the flights, which, well, interestingly on that point, there's been a lot of assumptions, particularly, for example, in the Airports Commission's work, that sort of aviation would at some point eventually pay its price, but right now that policy it doesn't exist, particularly on flights to non-EU destinations. There's no carbon taxation, there's no trading system, there's really basically no schemes in place to tax those flights fairly. So yes, there's high demand, but it's a sort of artificial creation of the way that government has set the incentives in the system.
Okay. Are you okay, Katie?
Yes, did you want to come back on that?
Well, I was just going to come back. I certainly agree that travellers and shippers should pay the full cost of their activity, and that's not happening at the moment. Where I do disagree a little, though, is that if they did, I don't think it would stop the growth of air travel, because we've seen the big fall in the cost of air travel is primarily because of very efficient aircraft engines from Rolls-Royce and others, which has lowered the cost of air transport.
Okay, on the growth of demand, specifically at Heathrow, where I think currently around 80% of travellers are leisure or friends of family and around 20% are business. Heathrow have confirmed today that they do want to go for a third runway, and also confirming that they're looking to increase passenger capacity on the existing configuration of runways and terminals, but within the cap. Who are the travellers who are projected to fill that increased capacity of of the expanded terminals and a third runway? Are they business or leisure? Are they interlining between UK and international, or international to international? What do we know about those projections of who those passengers are? And also, are they UK origin, flying out and back, or are they overseas, flying in and out again?
I think it would probably be all of the above. So I spoke before about how capacity constraints lead to worse connectivity, so lower frequency on existing routes and fewer connections in total, and higher prices on routes. So what we'd see is airlines would be adding new flights on existing routes, and the fact that there's more seats on those routes means prices will fall. So that reduction in price will be stimulating new demand. It's difficult to say exactly who will be on those flights, but the evidence in terms of price elasticities of demand will suggest that when prices fall, demand will increase. There'll also be brand new connections as well. So this will be sort of tapping into new markets and stimulating new demand that can get to these places with a direct connection.
Even though the number of destinations from Heathrow have fallen consistently over recent decades.
I mean, I see that as a bad thing. I see that because airlines
that's the market
exactly
has with a lot of routes are no longer that used to be
exactly, and I think that comes down to the decision of the airline to say, well, we've got maybe 6 flights a day to this domestic connection where we've got 120 passengers on the flight. Could we get rid of that flight and add on, a larger aircraft to New York, for instance, because we think we'll get more passengers? So I think if the capacity constraints were eased, we'd probably see an increase in those domestic connections, which were then squeezed out. Also, brand new domestic connections sort of added for the first time. So I think it's a combination of new connections, both sort of domestic and abroad, and greater frequency on existing routes, and that will lead to lower prices and drive demand.
Alex?
One way to look at it is to look at the last 10, 15 years as to what has happened. So, passenger numbers in the London airport system have grown by several million, and over that period, there hasn't been a single additional business passenger. Across the UK, the proportion of people who don't fly every year has remained roughly stable at around 50%, meaning that around about 2/3 of your new capacity is taken by people who already flying even more frequently. And then around about a quarter of your new capacity is the incoming passengers from foreign nations, indicating obviously that, again, around sort of 75% of the newly added passengers are UK residents flying out, not foreign residents coming in.
Right.
What we haven't mentioned, and business travel I think is really important in terms of how an airport can stimulate economic growth, but the other important role is air cargo and trade. And Heathrow is the UK's largest port. Enormous amount of trade goes through in the belly by value, which is that's the important thing, and airlines are carrying those goods that are high value, low weight, so they're supporting the high tech industries, the car industry, pharmaceuticals. That I think is where a considerable amount of the growth impact of expanding airport capacity could come from.
I'll just come back on that. But correct me if I'm wrong, there hasn't been any growth in air freight by weight, if any notable level, in the last 2 decades. Is that right?
Because things are getting lighter.
Okay.
Microchips.
I mean, that therefore indicates
that
that probably
matter,
new capacity maybe isn't needed. But I mean, broadly speaking, if there was huge freight demand, why are we adding, thousands of flights to Greece and the Canary Islands? We don't send any freight to those destinations. So if there was enough business demand of freight, then the
demand for passengers and for freight.
The key point is, I think the business passengers tend to line up better with the freight destinations, so that the leisure destinations are less so. If there was more freight demand out there and there was more business demand out there, it would be pushing out those really low value leisure flights. It would be dominating, but it isn't, because it should be willing to pay more than the market.
Can I sort of come in on that point? Heathrow is constrained. You cannot add more flights at Heathrow unless you take another flight away. If we're talking about connecting the UK to emerging markets, because of the hub and spoke model, Heathrow is the main gateway for long-haul connectivity. So those new long-haul connections will be added at Heathrow, but there are constraints. And so I fully expect that if there's expansion at Heathrow, there will be many more long-haul connections. There will be freight on those flights as well.
But how will domestic connectivity be able to compete in that context, given the high price of slots and landing charges?
Sorry, what do you mean by compete?
Well, I mean, Scott rightly was concerned about how expansion at Heathrow would benefit Scotland, for instance. But you're saying that much of the additional demand will be filled by long-haul flights, not by domestic connectivity.
I think there'll definitely be more domestic connections added. I mean, I think we've seen a reduction on the number of flights on domestic routes over time, and I think that's the dynamic I raised before, where airlines think let's drop one of these, get rid of one of these flights per day, and let's add it on another route. So with the capacity there, I think there would be an unwinding of that approach, and we would see more flights on domestic routes, and there would be more routes added as well. I also think the regions, in terms of trucking freight to Heathrow, they would then also benefit from those long-haul connections as well.
Is the fall in domestic connectivity or passenger numbers, is that not so much driven by airports switching to overseas routes, but by the decline in business travel within the UK? Because fewer people, I mean, I live in Edinburgh, I mean, pre-COVID, lots of people would come to Edinburgh London, they'd go to Edinburgh as well, for a 2-hour meeting and then nip back again. And I see that on the train. I use the train every week, and it's dominated by leisure travels now. Even I don't travel first class, but even in first class, I can see it's leisure travel rather than business. So is that change not what's driving the change in the domestic market, rather than airports switching to overseas routes?
I'd say there's probably a combination of different factors. So I think in terms of, during the pandemic, I think it's undeniable that many businesses took to Zoom and Teams and found that actually for certain types of meetings, it's really not bad. So you can imagine a scenario where you've got, say, intra-company meetings where you have 4 meetings a year, we all meet in the head office. You can imagine a scenario now where you think, actually, how about we just do 1 meeting a year face-to-face? Let's throw a big social event at the same time, and we'll do the other ones on Teams. So I think in that respect, I think sort of the online meetings is a real complement to aviation. But I think for some of those really important entrepreneurial meetings like pitches and conferences, and where face-to-face meetings are really important, they continue to be as important as ever. In terms of why there might be a reduction, I think the higher ticket prices at Heathrow could also be in part explaining that as well. So lots of different factors at play there, I think.
Okay, thanks. I think, Brian, initially, in terms of the timing of the announcements, 2 weeks ago, up until 2 weeks ago, when the Chancellor announced that the government was going to support Heathrow as part of a wider package of growth proposals, and therefore it was only today that we had the confirmation from Heathrow that they did want to go for a runway 3 and expanded capacity on the current terminals. So, assuming the government started this process, do you feel that the government's done the necessary groundwork to support this policy, given the time elapsed and significant changes since the department's last appraisal?
I certainly wouldn't want the enormous work that the Airports Commission did having to be repeated. I think there would be value in examining some of the key issues. We've talked about the importance of the hub status, because we are seeing new aircraft coming along, some of the narrow-bodied aircraft which do extra long range. They can provide long-haul distances between cities where before it wasn't viable. So I think it would be worth having a look at some of those issues. Of course, we haven't discussed the cost. I mean, one of the issues with the Airports Commission review was that it was the third runway was a very expensive option, which meant that although there were big benefits, the net gain was not very large.
Alex.
I think an awful lot has changed. The Airports Commission did do a kind of options assessment, I think, in the sort of interim phase, although I'm looking over here because you're more expert on what went on there. I believe that options assessment in terms of different ways of fulfilling the kind of UK's transport connectivity needs identified some things like Brexit, like EU legislation as obstacles to some of the options they could have explored. That has now been removed. I think the change in trends in business passengers has to be explored. And this government, I think, I might be putting words in their mouth, but I think what they want is green growth. So there's an exercise here to ask, can we secure these growth benefits, but without the environmental cost? Are there other options available to optimise what we can do with the system? And I do think that we probably should be looking at this question about the hub and spoke approach as well, because the world again is moving on. Schiphol is the classic example of another hub airport that we are in competition with, and yet over there they are also having this debate, and the airport itself has produced reports saying actually we're not sure that our own growth is in the societal interest. So when major competitors are asking those types of questions, the world has changed, and I think the government needs to have a careful look at what its strategic aims for aviation are. and alongside other issues like, for example, the fact that the Channel Tunnel is 50% below capacity. We've got assets. Why not sweat those assets in ways that don't damage the climate as much as the Heathrow case example would?
Okay, thank you. As I think your next question has mainly been covered.
Just a little sliver of it. So, and it's the hub and spoke models we mentioned a few times, and as a passive observer to the aviation sector, I think over the last 20 years there was a bit of debate about should we go to even bigger aircraft to connect between these hubs, or should we more point to point. And going back to Edinburgh, of course, I have to mention Edinburgh. I mean, the Scottish Indian community, they'd be delighted to have a direct connection between India and Edinburgh, rather than going via Heathrow. So I thought we'd moved away from hub and spoke, but investment in Heathrow is about hub and spoke. You're shaking your head. Hub and spoke is here to stay.
I think it is, yes.
Right, okay.
But both. Because I think what we've seen are new aircraft that are able to operate between cities economically, which they weren't before, offering point-to-point services. But those same aircraft are being used to make the spokes of the hub more effective. And I think that we are still going to be in a situation, not many cities, or the majority of cities, have to get service via a hub because there just aren't enough passengers to offer a viable service for a direct service. I think that's going to be with us forever. We're going to need a hub and spoke airport, but new technologies are opening new opportunities for a direct service.
And that argument applies equally to freight.
Freight doesn't care whether there's a direct service or not.
Yeah.
If a box can go anywhere, it's just the economics, the cheapness of it. So it's mostly for business passengers that it's important.
Well, and perishable goods.
Yes.
Okay, Mark.
I did just want to add on the point around kind of the hub and spoke. In terms of evidence that has been previously put towards the Transport Select Committee for the Aviation National Policy Statement, what they found there, yes, doing an expanded third runway at Heathrow would get between 7 and 11 more destinations, long-haul destinations from Heathrow. At the UK level, the modelling at the time found it was one more destination. So that was 10 to 6 being taken from other airports where they would have been point-to-point.
To add to that, we should recognise that comes with job losses. So we, at NEF, we put a Freedom of Information request in about 2020 to the DFT to ask them for their analysis of the impact of Heathrow expansion on the wider regions. And what that showed is that although we keep hearing this 100,000 jobs figure, which has an awful lot of problems with it, one of the problems with that figure is that's not the sort of aggregate UK level change, that's jobs in the southeast. And there was a potential up to 27,000 job losses around the wider regions that would be lost particularly in those wider regional airports because they could serve those routes and they would move to Heathrow if they didn't. So I personally think we do need a more transparent conversation at exactly how these different approaches to the system affect economic factors like those jobs.
Lawrence, you wanted to come in?
Very quickly, just in response to that last bit, that 27,000 estimate, was that a net loss figure?
So that was the number of jobs that would be displaced, the upper bound, because the 100,000 figure is the upper bound, the 27,000 figure was the upper bound of the number of jobs that would be displaced from the UK's wider regions to the London and the South East under the third runway scenario.
Okay, so that's not taking account of jobs that might be created, that's the gross rather than net figure, just to understand.
In the wider regions?
Yes.
Or... so that's the direct job loss. So that is that's a net figure for those regions, but not counting sort of wider economic impacts. That's within the sort of direct and indirect jobs.
Those are figures that people can find on NEF's.
That's in our report, baggage claim. Yeah.
Okay,
Can I come in on this sort of regional point as well? I think it's great that some regional airports could have long-haul connections. What we'll typically see is there are limits to how far regional airports can go in terms of their connectivity. So they can have, obviously, the much smaller airports can have lots of connections to big cities in Europe, sun and sand destinations, maybe the odd long-haul connection to New York. I think you've got a good example in Edinburgh. But the hub will always be key for those more secondary cities in China and India. I don't think we're going to see any long-haul connections from regional airports to secondary cities in China anytime soon. That will always come through the hub. And I think you gave some figures about the net change in connections and how they may be taking some connections away. If expansion will lead to more flights to secondary cities in India and China and other places in the emerging market, they don't exist already. So it's not as if we're going to be taking some of those Chinese flights away from regional airports. They don't exist at the moment. They will be at Heathrow, they'll be at the hub.
Okay.
Catherine. I wanted to ask about regional airports as well, and we do have East Midlands very close to Derby. What role do regional airports play in their local economies?
I suppose similar to what I described before in general terms. So they obviously will facilitate lots of different activity, so business, leisure, visiting friends and relatives, inbound, outbound, and so on. I think for the long-haul connectivity to some of these emerging markets, I think realistically that will still probably have to come through a hub, whether that's Heathrow or another hub airport as well. But yeah, I think these airports still provide those productivity and well-being benefits as well for those regions.
Anyone else want to talk about the regional benefits?
I've got nothing to add really. I agree.
I'd just say in terms of kind of one of the things I was kind of pleased to hear Chris being a bit critical of these kinds of assessments where people say, oh, this is how many jobs an airport has brought. I think we've got to be really careful when we look at, for example, an economic impact report from East Midlands Airport and then dividing up by the number of passengers or flights and just saying, oh, if we added 10,000 flights or however many, that we get that many extra benefits, because that's not how it works.
Alex?
Just to add to that, we do need to have a candid conversation about exactly what these airports are doing, because if we're talking about wider regional airports that are 80% outbound passengers and 20% incoming, and 90% of those passengers are leisure, we need to have a conversation about whether it's useful for the UK to be encouraging, as I say, because it's not just about these people have to go, it's about the incentives we put in front of them, whether it's useful to the UK to be encouraging such large volumes of leisure passengers to fly out of a region. That conversation doesn't.
East Midlands is a lot of freight, so it's slightly different.
It is mainly freight, yeah. So just homing back in on the potential of economic growth then. So regional airports outside of the southeast, what opportunities are there for economic growth delivered at a regional level but for nationwide benefit?
Well, I think we ought to. I agree with Mark that you shouldn't really focus on the sort of the jobs that the airport might create in its supply chain, but the use of that airport. So in the East Midlands, it's a major cargo centre. That is of great value to businesses and the UK, and expanding that exposure to trade expands the market for local businesses as well as others that might connect through that centre.
So I just say that obviously I'd be in favour of those kinds of regional airport expansions where they're justified. But the problem that we've kind of seen is that there aren't very many well-justified cases for expansion. They're all basically the same points about business growth due to business passengers. And as we've discussed, there's been no business growth. There's been no business passenger growth. And so they're all very kind of shaky in terms of what they're promoting. And I think that's just something that, at this point in the kind of the debate over the last 5 years should be recognised.
Did you want to answer a question now?
Yeah, so Heathrow as a problem, I don't know, the third runway feels a little bit like a solution looking for a problem in that regard. Do you think the government's been honest in terms of actually looking at the comparable benefits of, say, third runway at Heathrow versus, serious regional airport expansion, or even something specific, like if we're talking about trying to stimulate the right sorts of travel, business, trade-related, airports like Milan, Linate exist in areas where economic growth was, viable and much, much more possible. Do you think proper scenario analysis has really been done outside of the Heathrow argument?
I mean, for me, no. I feel that our national conversation on this issue is quite detached from the wider evidence base from the academic literature on what exactly is going on in aviation. I mean, the harsh reality is that there are a large number of studies out there from just the last few years suggesting that what you get from aviation expansion is diminishing returns. The higher your GDP, the higher your connectivity, the less you get back from each one that you add. And that conversation is going on outside the UK, but I don't think the government has had a proper look at that evidence for quite some time. And I would like to see them do that, at least before we barrel ahead with what is potentially on the table at the moment, to review that evidence, because there is a lot at stake here with the climate crisis. It's not just that we need to get, our bar shouldn't just be, well, there might be a bit of benefit here. Given the risks entailed, our bar needs to be there as an outstanding, clear, overwhelming level of benefit, nailed on. And I don't feel we're at that point at the moment.
Just briefly, I think we need to provide new airport capacity where it's needed. I think there's Heathrow's been full, will soon be full, but Heathrow's been full for 20 years. There's a clear case there. I'm not sure that's the case at many of the UK's regional airports. So I'd only provide it if there's a real demand. I'd say, though, that the real issue that has been discussed already is the climate impact of this. And I'm just not in favour of addressing that climate impact by constraining activity and not expanding a productive asset. We should do more to address climate impacts, but I don't think constraining airport capacity is one of those.
I'll just come at you on that. I think there's two very interesting arguments, quite separate perhaps, and I have some sympathy with the constraint as a way of reducing carbon emissions argument. But just back to the furrow, if you like, of alternative or maybe quite radical or creative regional expansion. I don't mean current airports, of course. If you look at where the capacity is in shortest supply, you're going to end up looking at London and the southeast. But is that really where the opportunity for connectivity-enabled economic growth exists?
I think on that point, we have constraints at Heathrow. So that is the market telling us we want more capacity at Heathrow. Airlines buying slots of each other for millions of pounds. If you think about other regional airports, I think I agree with Brian. Generally, there aren't really constraints. I mean, we can build another runway in regional airports, but I don't think they've necessarily got a capacity problem. It's the demand. So I think we should generally only really be expanding something if you've got clear evidence of constraints, knowing that when you then can ease that constraint, you'll expect to see an increase in activity.
I think that makes a number of fundamental assumptions about where economic growth can and can't happen, but I'll leave it there. Thank you. Sorry.
Alex?
I mean, for me, it's at capacity, therefore it must be expanded, is not an industrial strategy from a government. Actually, there's a lot more to look into than just that basic fact. I mean, take another transport example. If a motorway or a road is getting very busy, yes, you can make the road bigger, but you can also build a railway. There are other options. And just to say, to go back to my original point, yes, it may be receiving a lot of demand, but that demand is a complex mix of signals from the market related to carbon taxation, other forms of taxation, other forms of demand, not just an inevitability that it will always remain that way, and it should remain that way.
Yeah. Okay, I think we do need to move on. Lawrence, you've got some questions on overall growth.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask some questions about the Frontier Economics report specifically, so starting with Mr. Cuttle. At the end of last month, the Chancellor quoted your analysis and you're finding that there could be, I think, 184 billion in GDP benefits over a 60-year period using a CGE model, which I'm just looking to understand a bit better. In, I suppose, layman's terms, could you explain what sets your approach apart from previous analysis and perhaps more traditional input-output modelling?
I think, first of all, like the Airports Commission, we actually carried out two main pieces of analysis. So we carried out the CG model, which I could talk about in a second, but we also carried out this bottom-up cost-benefit analysis as well. So this was the Airports Commission's main approach. So the bottom-up approach is basically where you list what are the main impacts of expansion and you try to then estimate them separately. So you have construction costs, environmental costs and so on, add them to the cost side, then think about the benefits, add them to the benefit side, add them all up and see what the net benefit is. That was the Airports Commission's main approach that it took, and we've also looked at that approach as well. On the CG model, so the CG model is a computable general equilibrium model, sort of a long set of syllables there. They're quite complex mathematical models of an economy. So they're a real work of art, to be honest, where it models all these different sectors buying and selling goods with each other. And it can model how an expansion in one sector, so in this case in the transport sector, leads to changes in buying and selling of goods with other sectors as well. When the Airports Commission first looked at this, it noted that it was novel and innovative. It wasn't the main approach that it looked at. I think since the science around CG models have been improving. I'd point out that the UK government itself has started to look at CG models as well. They're also used in the US, World Bank, European Commission as well. And I think when we've got such a politically sensitive, complex issue, I think it only makes sense to look at different approaches. And I point out that our two models, they basically point to broadly the same answer, that there's a really strong net positive case for expansion. So I take some comfort that both separate approaches point to that answer.
Looking back at the work that was undertaken for the Airports Commission, and other witnesses might want to come on to this in a moment, and PricewaterhouseCoopers did undertake their own CG model, and if memory serves, the technical advisory group, which I think Professor Pearce was part of, said that it was the right general approach, but it was probably premature in terms of the quality of the data and assumptions behind it. I'm probably not doing the advice justice, but perhaps words to that effect. I mean, what account have you taken of that criticism? And you said that the modelling has advanced in the last 10 years. Again, for a non-technical audience, what does that mean?
Sure. So these models have been around for about 30 years, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated, more and more detailed. They're becoming larger as well, because they're models of the entire economy as well. I think where CG models add a lot of value is that they can shed insights in sort of two main points. One is this thing around crowding in and crowding out, and the other one is sort of regional impacts as well. So on crowding in and crowding out, we know that expansion at Heathrow will lead to kind of investment at Heathrow, but it will also then be supplemented with other private investment as well. So other private companies saying, well, we'll also invest as well then. We might build a hotel around the new airport and so on. So that would be an example of crowding in, where investment leads to further investment. And then there's examples of crowding out. So this will be where Heathrow expansion would be such a huge project that it will essentially be soaking up labour and finance from other sectors, and that will lead to higher prices in other sectors and lead to contractions in other sectors as well. So that's an example of crowding out. I think CG models do a really, really good job at trying to show those second and third order effects of these interventions. And then they've also got that regional angle as well. So they model different regions of the UK. It recognises there's different populations. It recognises that they've got different resources, and then so how a change at Heathrow can then, through the input-output tables, can sort of lead to impacts in other regions as well. But these models, they're improving. UK government's now using them. European Commission, World Bank are using them as well, and they'll continue to improve.
Thank you. Would anyone else on the panel like to come in on the merits of general approach or the frontier analysis specifically?
So I can't really comment on the frontier analysis. I've only seen the executive summary of the report. But as you said, I was involved in reviewing the PwC work, which did this equilibrium modelling to try and generate a GDP impact of a third runway. And at the time, my colleague Peter Mackie and I agreed with what has just been said by Chris. That approach is very useful to see whether an investment is just, rather than making a net benefit to an economy, is just pulling resources away from another sector or another region. That's very good value. They're widely used for things like looking at tax and VAT changes. I think they're certainly when we looked at it a decade ago, they were much less advanced in looking at seeing whether something like an airport would, in a particular sector, would create a productivity gain that would ripple throughout the economy. And in fact, the results that PwC got were essentially sort of bolted on to the CGE model. rather than the product of the model itself. So we were we were very cautious about interpreting results.
Mark?
I'd echo you from 1 decade ago, which was that one of your criticisms was about transparency of these types of models, where we've only seen an executive summary. What I'd be enjoying reading through would be the appendices, where I see what your view of the world is that goes into this model, where I see what assumptions you've made about changes. And that, I think, is the critical thing, because tweaking those numbers changes the result by billions. And I think I'd also just speak to the bottom-up approach. So again, this is an issue around kind of what we can see. You may have calculated a bunch of different things. You've only told us 3 of them. You said private sector, environment, HMT. Well, HMT gain, that's someone's paying that tax. So where's that coming from? It's coming from someone's pockets. So that's,
that example,
Yeah, so that's a negative, so it's a 0.
Passengers are paying government, it's extra revenue for government.
So is that 14 billion, is that all from foreign passengers, or is that?
That was from APD, so a mix of UK and foreign.
So some of that comes from British pockets?
Yeah, because they're flying.
Yeah, sorry.
Time is time.
Alex?
I have quite a few concerns. I mean, I think there are questions about the Chancellor announcing this figure to the nation without us being able to see the original documentation and what went in. Because I used to be in academia before I got my job at NEF, and they love a big model, a big complicated model. But there's 2 things they say. One, they would describe them as a black box, which is what they get bigger and more complicated, and you just can't possibly check what's going on there. And as a result, they would say rubbish in, rubbish out, and that means forecast assumptions that go in matter a lot. And of course, they then get processed through all sorts of complicated ways that we can't see, and a big number gets spit out. Now, I would say it's interesting that this number you're sort of saying basically, supports what the Airports Commission produced 10 years ago, but so much has changed since then. And after 10 years, business passengers have not grown at all. We've had Brexit, global economic stagnation, and nothing. Yet somehow, the number that comes out is just the same. For me, that requires a lot of interrogation.
And on that note, can we move on to your final set of questions, please, Lawrence?
Very quickly, and I think you'll anticipate the final question. The executive summary alone has been published. Would you provide a copy of the full report to this committee?
So it's basically Heathrow's report. It contains some commercially sensitive information, so I'll certainly have to go through Heathrow, but it's got commercially sensitive information about costs in there as well.
Well, we'll try asking as well.
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
I understand the report will be published at some point. It's down on Heathrow.
Okay.
Ultimately.
I think other questions we had lined up, I think have, thank you very much, been answered, except for, Lawrence, your last question on the carbon budgets.
Yes, I wanted to ask, and I think perhaps direct this to Mr. Postle, how should the government seek to balance its economic growth objectives with its net zero targets?
Well, I think that's a bit of a policy question for the government, how they should do it. I think how I would do it is cost effectively. The issue with, the framework of carbon trading, carbon markets, is that under a perfect carbon trading system, the savings, the reductions will flow to where it is cheapest to do until eventually there's a satiation and we reach the budget, we reach the amount of allowances in the system. The issue then becomes that we're not in a perfect carbon market. Only UK domestic flights, for aviation, only UK domestic flights are in the UK ETS and to EU destinations. EU flights they pay theirs coming in, but any other departure, they've got some small capture by Corsia, another system, but other than that, they are not within the market, especially arrivals, international departures. In addition to that, it's also widely recognized at this point that there are non-CO2 impacts from aviation. So it's not just about carbon emissions, it's about the wider climate impacts. These aren't in any tradable market, and there's no real way to do that at this time. So for every emission from aviation, it's potentially twice as damaging as an emission from a non-aviation source. So that does tell us 2 things. One, this can be a very good place to try and do mitigationary measures, but it also tells us that allowing additional expansion does more damage to the planet or to our carbon goals than other kinds of expansion.
And do you believe that staying within the overall carbon budget limit does set a cap on the economic benefits that could be derived from aviation expansion?
Well, I think the clue there is around how, in that modelling, the assumed carbon price that hits passengers is kind of brought through in it. So one of the things from the original, I think, Airports Commission work, when we were looking at a central carbon price of, I think, £227 in 2050, the assumed actual price that air passengers would have to pay was something like 330. We're now at the point where the 2050 price is higher than that in modelling and appraisal. So the question then becomes, like, how much of that growth gets constrained just naturally through that price, through that limitation, and that becomes the factor.
I do have one final question to the whole panel, which was if Heathrow expansion goes ahead, what carbon trade-offs may need to be made in other sectors? But I appreciate it's a broad topic, and I could see that Brian, I think you'd indicated as well.
Because I think we don't really need to worry about domestic aviation emissions because there's a cap in the UK ETS. We do need to worry about the international emissions, and actually, most of the aviation emissions are long haul, and so that would be a problem. The policy mechanisms at the moment, the Corsia cap and offset scheme, is ineffective. So the government really needs to look very closely on how it would be effectively mitigate and address those long-haul emissions. It could be through the fuel side, through tightening up the support for sustainable fuels, but at the moment that is an inconsistency.
And does anyone wish to come in on trade-offs in other parts of the economy?
So I think one thing that's worth noting, so the original sort of updated appraisal report looking at airport capacity in the South East and the Airports Commission, they had this really important assumption that we need to bear in mind, that carbon would be capped or traded across all emissions. And they used that assumption to then remove the carbon cost from the cost-benefit analysis. So when we saw the kind of what was actually a fairly poor cost-benefit conclusion in the updated appraisal report that was put to Parliament in 2018, that had already had all aircraft flight emissions, high-altitude emissions, excluded because of the assumption that this scheme would exist. That scheme doesn't exist, as we've just heard. Corsia is ineffective. So the assumption there is not robust. And as linked to that, the DFT's web tag appraisal has changed dramatically in the intervening years, particularly in 2023. So the way that you would now cost that would be completely different. You would have to cost the flight emissions, inbound and outbound, interestingly, and of course you can apply a multiplier for the non-carbon emissions. If you were to go back and rerun the 2018 appraisal with that new guidance and the new higher carbon values we've just heard about, these schemes are deeply negative from a societal well-being point of view. And those the same exclusions, which essentially allow you to pretend that those costs don't exist in the modelling, are also present in the frontier economics cost-benefit analysis. We're sort of pretending those don't exist because they've been dealt with by a policy that doesn't exist.
Okay. So on that point, I completely agree with the need to look into Corsia. It doesn't, at the moment, give confidence it's going to place a cap on emissions from long-haul flights. There needs to be that policy in place so that, like domestic flights and intra-EEA flights, we do have a cap. And what we'll see is that the total cap on emissions will be declining over time. Aviation may have an increasing share of that declining cap, but we'll know that we'll get to net zero. But for long haul, we don't have that confidence yet because of Corsia. So I think that needs to be looked into.
So I just realised we didn't answer your question as well about other sectors. Just very briefly, it's really, really important because clearly in a carbon traded scenario, particularly with the ETS, but potentially a future traded scenario with other emissions or in just a general national cap, other sectors lose out if aviation spends the carbon budget. The traded prices get higher, so we're talking about steel, manufacturing, chemicals production particularly, that are purchasing these allowances to trade. They get a lot more expensive if the aviation industry is over-consuming or is seeing significant growth. So that's one competition effect which I don't think is in any of the economic models that we've seen and discussed today. And secondly, of course, there's the further issue around the proposed solution, sustainable aviation fuel, which will also increase the costs of land and energy, potentially in the UK, if we're going to do it responsibly. And that will drive up costs for other sectors that require those same goods. And again, the models are not doing a good job of capturing the macro effects of that level of competition for a scarce resource.
Okay, thank you very much. We've slightly overrun. I'd like to thank the panel very much for your answering our questions today and your answers. If there's anything you feel you didn't answer properly or any additional material you'd like to make us aware of, please do. This session was recorded on BBC iPlayer, so it's available on Catch Up and also on on Parliament TV channel. And that brings our first panel to an end. And I'm going to suspend the meeting for a few moments while our next witnesses take their places at the table. The sitting is suspended. Order. Order, order. Welcome to our second panel. Could I please ask you both to introduce yourselves?
Well, good morning, Chair. I'm Mike Kane. I'm the Minister for the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Aviation, Maritime and Security.
Welcome to this committee.
And I'm David Silk. I'm the Director Aviation at the Department for Transport.
Right, thank you very much for attending today. Catherine, we've got our first Catherine question.
Ruth, what's the government's vision for UK aviation?
Well, thank you so much for the question. I've always, as an MP who was brought up in an aviation constituency in Manchester, I've been very proud of being a world-class aviation nation. We have the largest aviation sector in the world, apart from the USA and China. It adds 20 billion to our GDP. It employs 240,000 people directly. And last year, 2 million commercial flights took off and landed at the UK airports, ferrying 273 million people. And due to the CAA and great officials and why we're good at this, they did that in the most part extraordinarily safe, in a very safe manner. So my mission in this government is to make sure that we continue with that success and that growth, because we're good at it.
Thank you. And can I just ask about the aviation strategy and how that fits into the government's wider transport strategy?
So aviation strategy is usually dictated by the Airports National Policy statements, which government produces. The last one was produced in 2018, which was 2 whole governments ago now. So we do need to refresh that strategy, and what we are saying that if Heathrow or another party, credible party, come forward with a third runway proposal this summer, which the Chancellor has asked for, we will review the Airports National Policy Statement on the basis of that.
Is there already any thinking about how it fits with the wider transport strategy as it stands and how that will be impacted?
Well, of course, because aviation supports economic growth, it supports sustainability, it connects people, places and businesses as well, and just domestically and internationally, and it cements our regions, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the southwest, and the north of England. So it is integral to how it fits together. And then when you look at surface area access to aviation, we have national highways, we have Network Rail, we have local providers like Transport for London, TFGM, and others to make sure that all that provision is joined up. So one, we achieve the economic growth, and two, we make the customer experience the best we possibly can make it.
Could you just clarify, please, Minister? We've now got the announcement from Heathrow this morning confirming that they are going to apply for a third runway. And you said you were going to revise, in answer to Catherine's question about where's the aviation strategy for the UK, you mentioned the ANPS, but the ANPS refers just to Heathrow. So chicken and egg, which comes first, the ANPS for Heathrow or an aviation strategy for the whole of the UK?
Well, I think Heathrow's announcement today was particularly around Terminals 2 and Terminal 5.
So it's confirming that they do want to apply for Runway 3.
And they want to,
yes.
And we've invited them as a government to bring forward their proposals this summer. And what I'm saying is, when they bring forward their proposals, we will begin the process of reviewing the airport's national policy statement. And the scope of that will be determined by the Secretary of State.
When you say bring forward their proposals, I mean, it'll take 3 or 4 years to actually produce a DCO. What does this summer mean in terms of the level of detail you're expecting?
That we're expecting that their proposal will come forward this summer, and then it will go to DCO in future. But after we receive their proposal, we will begin the process.
You mean an indicative proposal?
Forgive me.
Do you mean an indicative proposal, given that
Yes.
they stood down their expansion team?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Alex.
Yeah. Thank you. Minister, you rattled through quite a lot of statistics in answer to the previous question. Can you tell us when the last time was that the department conducted an in-depth analysis of the value of aviation to the UK economy?
So we had so we've used Office for National Statistics. And what we know from that is that in 2023, air transport and aerospace contributed the 20 billion to the economy that I mentioned at the start of my comments. And in 2022, we estimated that was, we know that was 240,000 jobs in the system. Being an airport MP in my own constituency, the figures we don't have is we know that the direct jobs created inside the apron, there is a relationship to the number of supply chain jobs you create outside that. I would love in the future that we could get more defined statistics on that, but we don't have that currently. But just shy of 250,000 jobs in the UK.
Okay, and what recent work has the department done to assess the impact of the capacity constraints that we were hearing about in the earlier session?
Sorry,
yeah.
Chair.
Sorry. Capacity constraints in the southeast and the southeast airports. What current work have you been doing on that?
So the last ANPS, which was in 2018, clearly showed that we saw capacity constraints in the London airport system by the mid-2030s. I think today Heathrow announced that it had 6.3 million passengers through in January this year, which was 5% up. What we do know as a department is that Heathrow has been operating at 95% effectively full operation, except for COVID, for almost 2 decades now.
Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. The Chancellor announced at the end of January that the government would support a third runway in principle. What was the involvement of the department in coming to that announcement?
Well, full involvement with the department that has the expertise, the department that would take forward the expansion on behalf of the government, and the Chancellor's announcement was in full consultation with the department, and it's part of our collective responsibility that this is the government's vision for aviation.
The department already had a airspace modernisation programme priority. What effect does the Heathrow announcement have on your plans to modernise airspace?
As part of our manifesto commitment, our two key announcements in the manifesto, one was around sustainable aviation fuel, and we've introduced that mandate last year for 2% of all SAF coming forward from January the 1st to have a blend in the aviation fuel. Our other key manifesto commitment was to airspace modernisation. Our airspace is analogue in a digital age, designed closer to the time when Yuri Gagarin went into space than it is for today. We can improve resilience, capacity, noise, pollution if we do this. We've introduced the UK Airspace Design Service, which we consulted on. I think those consultations are at the end, but I'll allow David to answer the specific
question.
question.
Forgive me, but the question was on what impact would Heathrow expansion have on those programmes?
So airspace modernisation is needed in the South East irrespective of expansion, and so that's why, as the Minister said, we already have an active programme to update airspace in the Greater South East area. And the UK Airspace Design Service will help us do that in a more efficient and coordinated way than perhaps has been the case to date. We need to work through with the CAA and the UK Airspace Design Service as it is established what the implications of a third runway are for the airspace modernisation programme. Since early 2020, that programme has been developed on a 2-runway scenario. We now need to do detailed work with the CAA and the UK Airspace Design Service as it is established to pivot towards a 3rd runway scenario.
Thank you. And when do you anticipate that work being available?
Well, airspace modernisation is a multi-year programme. It's very complex. We have requirements through our CAP 1616 process to consult with communities as we take it through. This needs to be done over a number of years, and we need to think carefully about when we can designate the precise airspace changes as well. There's only so many changes you can do at once from a safety perspective. We need to do that work to ensure that the airspace is modernised in time for the 3rd runway to be up and running. So the detailed work we need to do with the CAA and UK Airspace Design Service is how do we ensure the airspace is modernised for a 3rd runway scenario in sync with the 3rd runway opening. Precisely when we can complete that work by, I don't know at present, but that is a task that we're turning to.
All right, and I think the committee might be interested in what effect the announcement will have on the overall timeline compared to before the announcement for that work being completed, but perhaps that's something we can return to at a different point. In 2018, the government of the day said that it would require Heathrow Airport to protect domestic flights into the airport, including through the public service obligation. Is that still government policy?
So I just wanted to add to the last piece. While airspace modernisation will give us the biggest bang for our buck in the South East, that doesn't stop us progressing Scottish airspace modernisation, the Manchester airspace and the South West airspace, and we've already just made some changes to the Manchester airspace as well. In terms of regional airports, we're not reviewing slot policy at the moment, but what the AMPS did last time was to clearly, and what government's intention is that we would want to see that slots to regional airports and to our nations would be baked in to any expansion, because we know that would increase the passenger experience, allow more people to hub out of the UK, and also increase productivity and growth at those airports as well.
Will you be updating the airport's national policy statement to that effect?
That's what I was saying just slightly earlier. Once we receive the proposal from Heathrow, which we expect to do this summer, that's when we'll begin that work about how it is already existing government policy from 2018, 2 governments ago, but we would want to see that baked in the future.
All right, thank you, Chair. And just one final question, which is, what is the earliest date that you think the first flights from a third runway could take off?
Well, I don't think I have the information to hand to answer that question. But if we have the Heathrow proposal for this summer, then we review the Airport National Policy Statement. The scope of that will be defined by the Secretary of State. Everybody says spades in the ground, but we expect to see spades in the ground very shortly now over Terminal 2 and Terminal 5 after today's announcement. And also it's being done at Scunthorpe because it's around industrial policy as well and improving the viability of the British steel industry. So we will see economic benefit almost immediately.
Sorry, would you say it will be 2 parliaments away or 3 parliaments away before the first flights take off from runway 3 if it was given approval?
Well, I still think the last time I think the Airport National Policy Statement was done, most of these things rarely take less than a year, but this scope will be defined by the Secretary of State. So I think we have to wait for that decision, and then we have to see the DCO decision come and how that's another year's process.
Well,
so
3 to 4 years for a DCO, I understand.
I'm happy to defer.
So, I mean, it is a matter for the scheme promoter in terms of putting together the development consent order. The government is also planning to take through a planning and infrastructure bill aimed at improving the national infrastructure regime, and that may have benefits in enabling the promoter to bring the DCO forward quicker than would otherwise be the case. But in terms of the precise timeline, at the moment, we're waiting for Heathrow's formal proposal to us in the summer. As the Minister says, we then need to conduct an AMPS review. It is then for the scheme promoter to bring forward a DCO. The Chancellor, I think, in some of her comments has set out an ambition for flights taking off from 2035, and I think Heathrow are aware of that ambition, and that will be relevant, I'm sure, to their consideration of how quickly they can bring these things forward.
Oh, you had a question.
Thank you. Thanks for calling on today. For some reason, you keep on mentioning Manchester Airport in your examples, and you mentioned those reserve slots that you hoped that Manchester would get. Now, I don't speak for Edinburgh Airport, which is just outside my constituency, but I think the point they were making to me was that there's untapped capacity in Luton and Gatwick, and what people using Edinburgh Airport want is more point-to-point flights rather than going via hubs. And I expect people using Manchester Airport are exactly the same. They want to go straight to their destination rather than go through Heathrow. But one of the concerning points that was raised in the previous session was that a Heathrow might rob those regional airports of those longer distance flights. And it means that what is now currently point-to-point, they may have to go via Heathrow. Is that a positive? Is that something you've considered? And should people not be coming from Manchester to London by train?
Or even Edinburgh.
Or even Edinburgh. We could segue into Avanti's performance for the past few years. It's interesting for me, Chair, as a young Manchester councillor and a campaigner, we're the only city that has built an international runway in the past 80 years, despite what others may say, which means our capacity to go to 55 million, and we currently have 200 point-to-point destination flights. Having said that about how good my airport is in my constituency, it will never, ever, or I'd say in my lifetime, get to some of the destinations that people need to go to. They will still have to hub out of somewhere. At the moment, a lot of business people and others in my constituency hub out of Schiphol, or they hub out of Dubai and take the weekend. I'd much prefer that pound is spent in the UK hubbing out of our hub airport if it's humanly possible.
What is that pound if they go via Heathrow rather than Schiphol? Is that the cup of coffee they buy in the Cafe Nero or whatever in this new Heathrow airport.
£10 sandwich.
I mean, is that the economic benefit? Is that it?
I think the economic benefit is that we have the capacity within the UK that people can get to anywhere in the world, and we are one of the most connected countries upon the planet because of our superb aviation system that I said at the top, and most of that is because Heathrow has got those number of destinations. With all the will in the world with our great cities, we're not going to penetrate some of those markets. That's because of population issues around those regional national airports, and also the public transport penetration, which isn't as good as it is in the southeast. I would like to see that better, and I know you've worked in this field yourself.
We're interested in ground transport.
Ground transport, of course, yes. But if we could improve that as well, I know that Edinburgh Airport, Manchester Airport and other regional airports could penetrate further point-to-point markets. But for now, if we want to stay competitive in an international system, we have to invest in our hub airports as well.
Thank you.
Who's catching my eye? Alex? Sorry?
Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
I'm ready when you are. Yeah. I'll move us on. But
no, I have a further question. So you talked about your desire that expansion at Heathrow would enable more domestic airports, regional airports, to get into Heathrow. But the previous panel stated that the trends in growth, the market trends in growth of aviation, particularly from Heathrow, are in long haul and thick routes such as New York, etc. And also there's the cost of landing at Heathrow, particularly if the landing charges have to cover the expansion costs. So how would you, as a government, guarantee the future connectivity of our regional airports into Heathrow if that is government policy?
Okay, well, in terms of landing charges at Heathrow, that will be a matter between airlines, Heathrow and the Civil Aviation Authority, which is obviously an arm's length authority from our department, and they will adjudicate that. In terms of the APNS, as I said, the one in 2018 was very keen that there would be protection for regional slots into Heathrow to prove it. You know, as I've said, it improves connectivity, allows people to connect to places where they couldn't connect from their point-to-point airports, and we know where we have airports, we have huge regional growth and economic activity. So we would, after a scheme promoter brings a plan forward this summer as part of the new statement, we would want to see that continue, that we protect regional slots into Heathrow, because some of them are just not good enough at the moment. You know, we had an urgent question, Chair, a few weeks ago about the Northern Ireland connections. You know, we want to be a clean energy superpower. If we're not connecting into Aberdeen in the northeast or Newcastle as well, which some of the connections are not good enough either, I want to see them improve over time.
Okay, and if the government does approve expansion at Heathrow, will it insist on long overdue additional rail access, surface access other than vehicular at an expanded Heathrow?
Indeed. So I think there are... It depends what scheme comes forward, I think. It's key to it.
Well, I think we're assuming as of today's Heathrow announcement, we're talking about a third runway, which will mean an additional terminal.
That's right, but we don't... We
significant expansion.
A significant expansion,
So will the government insist on increased surface access, new routes such as the Western Rail Link, Southern Rail Link, etc.?
So in terms of the Southern Rail Link and the Western Rail Link, we would expect that any promoter bringing that forward will have to take that into consideration. That was in our last AMPS, it will be in the next AMPS, and we expect that the promoter would fund, if that's what the scheme requires. We don't know that, I have to stress that. We haven't seen the scheme that they will bring forward. If that's what's required, we'd expect the promoter to be able to fund those schemes.
And in order that the benefits of Heathrow expansion can be properly felt outside of London and the South East, will you be considering adequate and better surface links to other parts of the UK?
I think what we saw today was that some of the evidence that you've probably received is that this could create 100,000 jobs, improve GDP by 0.3%, and that 60%, some analysis shows that the benefit to expanding Heathrow, 60% of that would be outside the South East as well. As part of how we improve transport links nationally, this government's moving at pace in terms of its bus services, its rail services, and I think we'll probably could be part of our APS if about access to the South East.
Well, as you know, the road connections around Heathrow are already heavily congested, so that was the point of my question. Okay, Steph.
Thank you. Minister, I'm glad you brought up those economic statistics, because that's very much the focus of today's sort of rather sudden inquiry into these announcements. What do you say to the argument that this isn't really about considered economic growth? It's just a nice big construction project that's easy to get funded, and that surely if the government wanted to support economic growth, it would look at the regional capacity in those areas where the big opportunities for industrial development exist in the future.
Regional capacity of airports? Yeah. So I think that's a really legitimate question. If I pivot back to me being involved in opening the second runway at Manchester in 2001, which was the design concept was around about 96. It took about 4 to 5 years to get that from design and concept and up and running. We've seen, 2 million square feet of high advanced manufacturing currently going in at Manchester Airport. We've seen the relocation, we've seen Amazon fulfillment centre, we've seen the Hutt Group invest, DHL, the logistics. We know where we have regional airports, you get regional economic growth, and I think that's key. And also in terms of passenger numbers, most airports in the UK, I'll say, had their best year last year. As I just suggested, that Heathrow had its best month ever in January, best January ever. So we know that they're going up. Currently, John Lennon is serving 7 to 8 million people a year. Manchester's going to announce 31 million, rising to probably about 40 in the next 7 to 8 years. So we're seeing growth everywhere, and I think that's good for our regions.
So if I could just come back to the question about maybe it's chicken and egg like the chair referred to earlier, but if we were strategically interested in airport expansion for the purposes of economic growth, surely we wouldn't just start with the assumption that because Heathrow's got the greatest restrictions on demand that we should expand that before we even come to looking at the plans again.
If wishing made it so, but this is an industry that exists mainly in the private sector. And most people actually want to hub in and out of Heathrow. There's no doubt about that. Also, most of our air freight comes in through Heathrow as well. Other places do really well in Scotland, East Midlands and places like that, but the vast majority of that, and the capacity constraint on our cargo is huge as well. So we have to do all those things. We have to see, we can't direct planes where to go. And also when you've got cargo, some of those long-haul routes that I talked about earlier become a lot more attractive because they can fill their belly hold as well as their passengers. Whereas in some of our regional airports, we can often fill the passengers on the plane but not get the belly hold, which makes some of those routes commercially viable. So we need to do all of that.
Yeah, I actually accept what you're saying about the fact that the industry is controlled by private companies more or less, and there's very little perhaps we can do to direct what they do. doesn't that rather undermine the claim that this is a big economic growth opportunity that's within our strategic grasp, therefore?
I don't think there's very little we can do with, there's lots we can do, and this government's doing it. If I talk again about my own conurbation, getting the buses to run on time, bringing in their local franchises, getting that the conurbation can get to the airport within an hour's public transport penetration, that makes a material difference to regional airports. And this government, through its Better Buses bill, means that connectivity will improve, solving the rail disputes to our airports.
Okay, but we're talking about the economic case for airport expansion here, not the valid economic case for improving bus connectivity, which I totally agree with.
Yeah.
Are you saying there is a lot we can do strategically with policy to grow the economy through airport expansion, or are you saying actually we've just got to service and enable the private sector capacity demands?
Well, we need private sector investment to do this. What I'm saying about an expansion, when proposals come through for Heathrow, is that better connectivity to Heathrow, to the regions, will automatically, I believe, improve economic activity at those airports.
Yeah, but are you going to fix that? Because if left to the market, as we learnt in the earlier session, regional airports lose out.
So the APA, I was saying the powers, the ability to act through the ANPS, through that statement, that will be us looking at that and about how that connectivity is baked in to the rest of the country if a proposal comes forward for Heathrow to expand.
But what mechanism will you use to fix the proportionality of Heathrow, the expanded Heathrow, the flights there? How will you fix the proportionality to ensure the regions retain their access? Can you do it all through public service obligations, or how?
Well, the scope of the APNS will be determined by the Secretary of State, and so I can't fully answer that question. But from the last one, and I can guarantee you the next one, we will look at this and about how to do it better. In terms of the public service obligation, I think there are only 3 at the moment. I think there's like Newquay to Gatwick, there is Derry City to Heathrow, and Dundee?
To Heathrow.
To Heathrow as well. The only 3 PSOs, and at the moment we haven't got any thoughts of changing those at the moment.
Did you want to come in at that point, David? What mechanisms might be available?
As the Minister said, the previous ANPS set a very clear expectation that additional domestic routes would be provided through Heathrow expansion. We need to look at that again in scoping the next ANPS. But I think the Minister wants to ensure that there is, that it delivers on domestic connectivity. So we need to work that through as part of the ANPS. Okay. There are other tools in the kit. We have a making best use policy, which enables and supports regional airports in making the best use of their existing assets. That making best use policy is in part based on our understanding of the capacity constraints in regional airports at the moment. They are not full up, and therefore making best use of their existing assets feels like the right planning policy in order for them to make the most of what they have. You mentioned public service obligations as well. The Minister referred to 3 of those public service obligations, but we remain open to looking at PSOs for routes that are at risk, and in particularly unconnected places. So there are a range of tools we can look at in order to support regional airports at the same time as expanding Heathrow.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you. So the Chancellor said that Heathrow expansion will deliver economic benefits across the country, meeting one of the government's 4 tests. But frontier economics analysis shows that the growth will be strongly weighted towards London and the South East. Have you quantified the benefits that will be delivered for regions other than London and the South East?
Well, I've read the Frontier Economics. I mean, that is a report sponsored by Heathrow, but they clearly said that, I think I mentioned about a 0.43 rise in GDP. That would be good for the country, and that 60% of that benefit would be outside the South East. But the only quantification, I want to speak to the government's departments of the statistics I gave you earlier around the Office of National Statistics, that in 2023 it was 20 billion that aviation was, and in 2022 it's 240,000 jobs. We expect those 2 figures, when we next come to review them as a department from the ONS, to have to have improved substantially because of just the passenger growth we've seen in the last 12 months, but exponentially if we get a construction projects around Terminal 2, Terminal 5 and a potential Runway 3. And don't forget all the other investment that's going on, £1 billion transformation plan of Terminal 2 at Manchester and a huge terminal improvement plan at Birmingham as well currently going on. There's lots of investment going on in many places in terms of aviation across the country.
And this growth, where's it predominantly coming from? Is it business passengers? Is it leisure passengers? Is it freight?
It's everything. So,
would you like to rank them?
Would I like to rank them? We're just full. We're full. Heathrow is full. It's 95% plus at the moment, and that can be damaging. That means we begin to leak people to hub elsewhere, taking the pound out of the UK. It means we can't get our goods and freight in because it's also the biggest airport as well. We're full and we need the capacity, and I think that would an improved Heathrow, also baking in those regional connectivities, would improve jobs and services right across the realm.
Because one of our witnesses on the previous panel did tell us that business use of air travel hasn't really seen any net growth since 2006. So do you really believe that there is this untapped demand out there, or would not the market have kind of corrected and taken away some of those leisure flights?
Well, even if there wasn't business growth, there's leisure growth. Even if there wasn't leisure growth, there's more demand for freight growth. I met recently with most of the major airline freight providers in the UK, and they all had the same issues about getting slots at Heathrow, and the pressures that would come in the future around what time these people could fly or come in, what type of aircraft they use, will get worse unless we actually improve capacity in the South East, but particularly at Heathrow.
Thank you. And then moving on, the expansion of Heathrow is clearly likely to be very largely funded by the private sector. But what cost do you think there'll be to the public purse?
Well, we're going to have to review the AMPS, and that's what civil servants will do. So there is an indicative cost of doing that. But I will go back to the point that we don't know what the proposal is going to be, but they have to meet targets that we provided in the last one. I haven't got them to hand at the moment about how many. It's surface access improvements that solely benefit the airport are typically funded by the airport themselves. So how many people get there by train, what sort of car reduction we want to see is going to have to be met, not from the public purse.
Would that include tunnelling the M25 underneath the runway?
Well, we haven't seen what the
assuming
proposal
they
is.
come back with the proposal, the proposal we had last time.
We would expect this to be privately sectored.
So moving the incinerator, the immigration centre,
I hear
M25.
about this incinerator a lot. I must get a briefing note on the incinerator.
But you're saying that all the additional costs and
we haven't seen a proposal, so I can't talk about the incinerator. I can't talk about the M25. I can't. All I can say is surface access transport will have to improve to get more passengers to Heathrow, and therefore we expect any Heathrow or related party that come forward with that to show how they can fund it.
Okay, so the off-perimeter costs of expansion, and would that also include the noise insulation for all of those residents who don't currently experience significant aircraft noise, who would do, given the flights are going to be arriving over a built-up area of West London? Well,
I would say that as somebody who grew up under the flight path at Manchester, I remember in the 70s...
These people aren't currently under a flight path.
The BA 111s, the Tridents, the Concords. I even saw the Space Shuttle do a low pass on a jumbo jet one day. We know... we have two members from Derby here through Rolls-Royce and others that those engines are getting a quieter, more efficient, more carbon efficient. So we need to I think in the future about noise envelopes around airports in particular. But the answer specifically, I think, to your question, Chair, is yes. You know, we'd expect that to be funded by the promoter of the scheme.
So the previous AMPS had clear obligations on community compensation, mitigation packages, noise insulation. There were also provisions around night flights, limiting night flight movements, and so on. We obviously need to work through this again in the next AMPS, but there is a precedent for having clear obligations on that in the previous one.
Okay, right, let's move on. Ollie, thank you for that. Ollie.
Yes, the government's been very clear about its search for economic growth. But just taking some of your comments, of course, I think anybody who's experienced of anti-West Coast between Manchester and London would very much agree with your review. And personally, I will not travel on them at all because I've had so many nightmare experiences. But you know, going back to the plans for HS2 Northwestern leg would deliver economic growth. Making the most of the fact that Channel Tunnel and High Speed 1 utilisation is under 50% would generate economic growth, particularly with so many flights from Heathrow to places relatively easy to reach by rail in terms of like Paris, Brussels, Geneva, Frankfurt, etc. So, you know, why is there such a commitment to this particular project rather than several other infrastructure projects which presumably have just as much potential to deliver nationwide growth?
Well, thank you, and I know your previous experience in the rail industry is helpful. For those of us who live in the north, it's not a great connection, maybe possibly Manchester to London on a good day, but Scotland, the northeast, Wales, some parts of the south as well, those connections are not good enough. And we can't just live in a bubble in the southeast that we have a world-class transport area, transport system in one part of the country, then expect everybody else to live, by the same standard. You know, for some people, it's going to be easier from Edinburgh and Glasgow or Aberdeen to fly, or Prestwick to fly to Heathrow to hub out of the rest of the world, because if they can get their Avanti to work, we hope the Avanti will work, and the rail minister's working at pace to improve performance there. I know in France, haven't they? They've taken out some domestic routes where they have high-speed TGV lines, but you will know those lines are world class and world quality, whereas we've got one brilliant high-speed one line, but high-speed 2 is not where we would want it to be as a nation whatsoever. If high-speed 2 actually gets to Birmingham, which we think it will now, by 2030, you suddenly have Birmingham Airport with, I think, around 11 million passengers currently, with huge potential as well, being only about 35-40 minutes from Old Oak Common. So you bring in extra capacity that way. But for the rest of us, that rail connectivity, that local connectivity isn't there. I think for the 5 great northern runways, improving Liverpool, the 2 at Manchester, Leeds, Bradford and Newcastle, improving TransPennine and Northern, and the electrification of those lines through Manchester, where the Manchester hub, where there is capacity constraint, will actually unlock the potential of those lines, those airports as well that exist along those lines.
Yes, I mean, you're quite right to say about France, and the reason why they've been able to do some of those policies about domestic flights is because of a comprehensive high-speed network. Paris to Bordeaux, 2 hours, 5 minutes, Paris to Marseille, 3. And Paris to Marseille is similar to London to Scotland. So it just is interesting that, yes, and I think we can all agree HS2 is not in a good place, but it's interesting that we don't feel we can match that French ambition and competence, particularly given our determination to have national pride. Do you think we should be looking more at that as alongside projects such as the one we're discussing today?
Oh, I think undoubtedly. I mean, HS1 has been an unparalleled success. HS2 will get to Birmingham. We'll see what happens on that. We have capacity constraints on our West Coast main line. The French did some of this around carbon emissions, but for UK domestic aviation, it only accounts, I think, for about 4% of our emissions. We have to look at other ways that are going to be more effective to decarbonise, like the Rolls-Royce engines, like the sustainable aviation fuel mandate, like the revenue certainty mechanism that we hope to legislate for in the next few months to begin to build some of that SAF production in our own nation.
So moving on to the some of the environmental aspects. I mean, you mentioned sustainable aviation fuel. According to the IATA website, the first test flight with biojet fuel was in 2008. But even today, SAF production only accounts for 0.3% of global jet fuel use. Given that very, very slow progress of adoption of that technology, do you feel that given that aviation is projected to be the sector that will make the least progress in cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, is this really the sector that's the most appropriate vehicle for achieving economic growth given our climate commitments?
I think you stated that as being slow progress, and I would say to you in all genuineness, if I was going there, I wouldn't be starting here, is the famous line, but this government's acted at incredible pace. Elected in July, the mandate put through Parliament, I think in the September for the 2%, the 2% coming in to force on January the 1st this year. We know that airlines have sourced that fuel. We want to see more of that fuel sourced in the UK in the future, and if when parliamentary time allows in this session us legislating for the revenue certainty mechanism, so we establish a strike price that will give investors more confidence about building those type of facilities here in the UK, we could I could not have acted quicker in this manner to begin the decarbonisation of aviation, in addition to establishing the UK Airspace Design Service, which we've just finished consultation on and will get up and running, which we had questions on earlier.
Okay, thank you. Catherine.
Just in follow-up, the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change has stated that any aviation expansion has to take place within carbon budgets and within environmental limits. And you have already talked about the fantastic work that Rolls-Royce is doing in pushing decarbonisation. But what else can we do to actually achieve that? Can it be achieved?
Well, I think I said that we've got to 2% here of the mandate this year, which the new government has legislated for. I just checked my figures, but that rises to 10% by 2030, 22% by 2040. And also we're investing, I see, £135 million in the Advanced Fuel Fund as well. And I think we've invested about £1 billion, this new government, in the Aeronautical Technological Institute as well, to look at how we continue to improve those engines, how we get them quieter, how we get them to use less carbon in the meantime. And we are still looking at alternative to jet fuel for flights. I would love to be the first minister, or at least to leave it to my successor, to have UK internal flights with nothing coming out of the tailpipe. So that's through the use of hydrogen or battery hydrogen. I'm not there yet, but I hope to get there, or I hope to leave that legacy for my successor.
Okay, thank you. So the previous panel one today, confirmed what others have said, that any rise in aviation carbon emissions are going to result in carbon constraints in other sectors. So what work has the government done to understand how higher carbon constraints in other sectors may affect overall economic growth?
Well, yesterday I was in Geneva speaking on the floor of the UN at the United Nations Economic Council for Europe on the Inland Transportation Committee. So we are working right across the globe and showing leadership in this to try and reduce our emissions right across the globe, particularly across the continent, working with our international partners. Because I also have the maritime brief as well. We've got UK Ship to Shore, reducing 50% of our emissions by improving our grid to our ports, looking at advanced fuels in maritime, the Maritime Clean Energy competition that we sponsor as well. So there's a whole range of ways the department currently and the government are looking to decarbonise our transport network.
Were you just covering within the transport sector?
Well, indeed, and also because of maritime, we have the International Maritime Organisation right here in the UK. In addition to our work on seafarers' rights that we've already introduced, we are pushing for higher environmental standards in the maritime sector right across the planet at this year's Council about taking out more greenhouse gases as well.
So in order for the UK to abide by its legally binding carbon commitments, it's going to have to reduce its overall carbon emissions and that means not just within transport sectors, but transport is going to have to work in conjunction with, say, the carbon needs for steel and other sectors. So what work has the government done on that? What work has the DfT done with other government departments?
So since entering Parliament 11 years ago this week, I've been involved with sustainable aviation. And they have developed a clear pathway of what needs to happen within aviation to reduce our emissions. Currently, Chair, there is no way to completely reduce carbon emissions without some form of carbon capture technology as part of that pathway, and that's why government, I think, invested 22 billion. There was an announcement by the Prime Minister over on Merseyside a few months ago, investing in Stanlow and Merseyside and in the Tees Valley as well around carbon capture and technology. So part of the pathway will be through that as well.
And with aviation expansion, what analysis has the DfT done on the non-carbon greenhouse gas implications of aviation and aviation expansion?
So we currently have a study on what comes out of the tailpipe in terms of the other gases and the impact that that has on climate change. And we work with sustainable aviation about looking at that pathway to decarbonise, to make it net zero by, I think the target date is 2050.
2050. And when will that report be released?
That's out in the public realm now. That piece of work's in with sustainable aviation is in the public realm right now.
It's already
you clearly see the graph through airspace modernisation, hydrogen, battery, improve technology, airspace modernisation, the pathway. But you cannot get down to a zero pathway to decarbonise aviation. Carbon capture and technology has to be part of it.
So you're going to rely on carbon capture rather than rely solely on the expansion of SAF and airspace modernisation to achieve the decarbonisation in the aviation sector, while also going for expansion overall.
Yes, I have seen the figures. I can't remember them offhand.
You send them to us.
Yes, we will send them to you.
So broadly speaking, we need to reduce the carbon impact of aviation by about 53 megatons by the middle of this century. We have previously set out plans of how we will reduce that to about 19 megatons through a combination of SAF, fuel efficiency, zero emission flight, carbon pricing policies with the rest of the world, and through investment in the Aerospace Technology Institute. So there is a credible path for reducing it down by about 30 megatons of carbon over the next 25 years. As the Minister said, to get beyond that, at the moment in our plans we assume a degree of carbon capture.
To your, if I may, to your point, Chair, I think if you're going to have growth in aviation, that means the budget for carbon that you're increasing aviation share of has got to come from somewhere else, and that could potentially harm economic growth in other sectors. Surely.
So we need to set out, the government needs to set out its plans on the carbon budget 6 period later on this year. we're working with DESNE's colleagues on how we put together those plans. As we do so, we need to work out what the economic consequences of them are.
Okay.
But that is work that is ongoing across government, led by our DESNE's colleagues, that DFT are obviously making a significant contribution to.
Very interested to see that at the time.
Yeah, and I'm sure other parliamentary colleagues will be looking out
I don't think
for that as well.
it's binary either, that they are growth industries in carbon capture and technology and SAF industries that we are legislating for. These are creating growth industry, the industry of the future. And in parts of the country, as we know, some of our coastal communities, and particularly in the north and the central belt in Scotland,
and Bacton in Norfolk, of course,
that have deindustrialised. So,
Okay, well, that's all right then. Thank you very much to our witnesses. Thank you very much to the Secretariat for the very hard work at short notice in producing our papers for today, and thank you to colleagues for your questions. As I said to other witnesses, if there's anything else you want to send us, please do so. The evidence is really helpful, and as I said at the beginning of today's session, it's an area aviation is an area we will come back to in due course. We've got current inquiries ongoing at the moment. That concludes today's meeting. Order